The knock on my door at 9:47 p.m. changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The woman standing there had tears streaming down her face, clutching what looked like a pregnancy test, and the first words out of her mouth were, "I'm sorry, but your husband is the father of my baby." I stood there in my pajamas, my coffee mug still warm in my hands, staring at this complete stranger who had just shattered my world with a single sentence. My husband David was upstairs, probably scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that our 7-year marriage was about to face its biggest test. But here's the thing that haunted me from that very first moment. I didn't believe her. Not because the evidence wasn't compelling, not because my husband was incapable of cheating, but because something in my gut, something deeper than logic or fear, told me this woman was lying. And that instinct would either save my marriage or destroy it completely. My name is Sarah. And this is the story of how one night, one lie, and one decision changed everything I thought I knew about trust, love, and the people we choose to believe. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand why I made the choice I did, you need to know who David and I were before that knock came. David and I met in college, in one of those ridiculously romantic ways that make people roll their eyes. I was struggling with organic chemistry, sitting in the library at midnight, probably on my 4th cup of coffee, when this guy I'd never seen before slid into the chair across from me and said, "You know, you're holding that molecular model upside down." I looked up, ready to tell him exactly where he could shove his unsolicited advice, but when I saw his face, this genuinely kind expression, not condescending at all, I just started laughing. 'Cause he was right. I had been holding it upside down for the past hour. That was David. Always right but never mean about it. Always helpful, never patronizing. We started studying together, and within 3 months we were inseparable. He had this way of making even the most stressful situations feel manageable. When I was freaking out about exams, he'd bring me tea and sit with me until I calmed down. When his father had a heart attack junior year, I held him while he cried, and I knew I wanted to hold him through every crisis for the rest of our lives. We got married 2 years after graduation. Small ceremony, just our families and closest friends. I remember standing at the altar, looking into his eyes, and thinking I was the luckiest woman alive. David was steady, reliable, honest to a fault. The kind of man who returned extra change to cashiers and called his mother every Sunday without fail. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of Sunday morning pancakes and terrible movie nights and arguments about whose turn it was to take out the trash. 7 years of supporting each other through job changes and family drama, and the devastating miscarriage we went through 3 years ago. That miscarriage nearly broke us. I blamed myself, he blamed himself. And for months we existed in this bubble of shared grief that we couldn't seem to burst. But David never gave up on us. He went to counseling with me, he held me through the worst nights, and slowly, painfully, we rebuilt ourselves into something stronger. Which is why, when that woman showed up at my door claiming to be pregnant with my husband's baby, every fiber of my being rejected it. Not David. Not my David. The man who cried when our neighbor's cat died. The man who sent flowers to my office just because it was Tuesday and he thought I looked tired that morning. But as I stood there in my doorway, staring at this crying woman, I realized that 7 years of marriage doesn't make you psychic. It doesn't give you the ability to know, with absolute certainty, what another person is capable of. And maybe that realization scared me more than the accusation itself. Her name was Jessica, and she was everything I wasn't. Where I was practical and straightforward, she was emotional and dramatic. Where I wore jeans and t-shirts, she wore flowing dresses and too much jewelry. Where I spoke in measured sentences, she spoke in breathless rushes of words that tumbled over each other. "Please," she said, stepping closer to my door, and I could smell her perfume. Something floral and expensive that David definitely would have noticed. "Please, I know this is horrible for you, but I didn't know what else to do. He won't return my calls, and I'm scared, and I'm alone, and I just need him to know." I wanted to slam the door in her face. I wanted to tell her she was crazy, that she had the wrong house, the wrong man, the wrong life. But something in her voice, something raw and desperate, made me pause. What if she was telling the truth? What if my husband, my steady, reliable, honest-to-a-fault husband, was living a double life? "I need to see him," Jessica continued, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I need to tell him about the baby. I need to know what we're going to do." That's when I heard David's footsteps on the stairs behind me. Heavy, familiar, the same rhythm I'd been hearing for 7 years. The sound of my husband coming to see what was keeping me at the door so late at night. "Sarah, everything okay down there?" His voice was concerned but not panicked. The voice of a man who assumes his wife is dealing with a lost package or a neighbor's cat, not a pregnant mistress. Jessica heard his voice and her entire body changed. Her shoulders straightened, her breathing quickened, and for just a moment, her face lit up with something that looked disturbingly like joy, like recognition, like love. And that's when I knew, with the kind of certainty that hits you like cold water, that whether or not she was telling the truth about the pregnancy, she definitely knew my husband. The question was, how well? David reached the bottom of the stairs and walked toward the door, and I watched his face carefully. I was looking for recognition, for guilt, for any telltale sign that would confirm or deny Jessica's story. What I saw instead was complete, genuine confusion. "I'm sorry," he said politely, looking past me at Jessica. "Do we know you? It's pretty late for..." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her face clearly, and I watched, with the intensity of a scientist studying a reaction, as his confusion deepened into something closer to alarm. "Oh my God," he said quietly. "Jessica Martinez, from the insurance office." And that's when the pieces started falling into place, but not in the way any of us expected. Jessica worked at the insurance office where David handled our car insurance renewal 6 months ago. I remembered him mentioning it. How the woman helping him seemed a little intense and overly friendly. At the time, I thought it was just David being David, reading too much into normal customer service. But as Jessica stood on our doorstep, still clutching that pregnancy test, still crying, I realized that David's discomfort 6 months ago might have been more justified than either of us realized. "Jessica," David said slowly, and his voice had changed. It was gentler now but also firmer. "You need to go home. This isn't... Whatever you think this is, it's not real." That's when Jessica's mask started to slip. The tears were still real, but underneath them I could see something else. Something desperate and unhinged and terrifying. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen," she shouted, and now neighbors' lights were starting to come on. "You can't just use me and then throw me away like I'm nothing." David's face went pale, but not with guilt. With the dawning realization that we were dealing with something much more serious than infidelity. We were dealing with someone who had constructed an entire fantasy around a professional interaction. "Jessica," I said quietly, stepping forward. And I don't know what made me do it, what instinct kicked in, but I found myself speaking to her like I would to a frightened animal. "Can I see the pregnancy test?" She held it closer to her chest. "You don't believe me either. No one ever believes me." And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Pity. Not for the woman who was trying to destroy my marriage, but for someone who was clearly struggling with reality in a way that went far beyond this single delusion. "I believe that you're pregnant," I said gently. "But Jessica, my husband has never been alone with you. He's never been anywhere with you except that insurance office, with other people around. Whatever happened, whatever you think happened, it didn't involve him." That's when she broke down completely. Not the manipulative tears from before, but genuine heartbroken sobbing that came from somewhere so deep and painful that I had to fight not to cry myself. "I just wanted someone to care," she whispered between sobs. "He was so nice to me and no one's ever nice to me, and I thought maybe." David looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same thing I was feeling. This wasn't about our marriage. This wasn't even really about us. This was about someone who was so desperately lonely, so disconnected from reality, that she had built an entire relationship fantasy around a few professional interactions. We ended up calling Jessica's sister. It took some gentle questioning, but we found out that Jessica had been struggling with mental health issues for years, and this wasn't the first time she had created elaborate fantasies about relationships that existed only in her mind. The pregnancy test was real, But the father was someone from her past. Someone who had genuinely abandoned her when he found out. In her mind, traumatized by abandonment and struggling with reality, she had somehow transferred those feelings onto David, the one person who had shown her genuine kindness during their brief professional interaction. Her sister arrived within an hour, apologetic and grateful that we had called instead of the police. Apparently, Jessica had disappeared 3 days earlier, and her family had been worried sick. As they drove away, David and I stood in our doorway, exhausted and shaken by what had just happened. The rain had stopped, and our neighborhood had returned to its normal, peaceful quiet. "Thank you," David said quietly, "for believing me, for trusting me." And I realized something important in that moment. I had trusted him. Despite the evidence, despite the compelling story, despite my own fears and insecurities, some part of me had known from the very beginning that my husband was innocent. Not because he was incapable of cheating, but because I knew him. Really knew him. After 7 years of marriage, after all we had been through together, I knew the man I had married. But more importantly, I had learned something about compassion. Jessica wasn't evil. She wasn't trying to destroy our marriage out of malice. She was a deeply troubled woman who was struggling with reality and loneliness in ways I couldn't imagine. The next morning, I called her sister to check on Jessica. She was getting help, professional help, and her family was rallying around her in a way that gave me hope that she would find the support she so desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, David and I talked more than we had in years. About trust, about assumptions, about the difference between blind faith and the kind of deep knowledge that comes from truly paying attention to another person. We also talked about Jessica, and about how easy it would have been to handle the situation differently. We could have called the police immediately. We could have slammed the door and let someone else deal with her crisis. But I'm glad we didn't. I'm glad that in a moment of potential crisis, we chose compassion over fear. I never found out exactly what happened to Jessica's baby, or whether she got the help she needed long term. But I think about her sometimes, and I hope that somewhere out there, she found the genuine connection and support she was searching for in all the wrong places. As for David and me, we're stronger now than we were before that night. Not because we survived a crisis, but because we learned something valuable about the kind of people we want to be when crisis comes knocking at our door. Trust isn't about blind faith. It's not about assuming your partner is incapable of disappointing you. Real trust is about knowing someone so well, paying attention so carefully, that you can distinguish between what's real and what's not, even when the evidence seems overwhelming. And sometimes, real trust means extending that same careful attention and compassion to the people who threaten what we hold dear. Because often those people aren't threats at all. They're just human beings struggling with pain we can't see and battles we don't understand. So, am I the asshole for not believing my husband when a woman showed up claiming she was pregnant with his baby? I don't think so. I think I did exactly what any partner should do when faced with a crisis. I trusted my knowledge of the person I married. I approached the situation with both caution and compassion, and I chose to see the humanity in everyone involved. But maybe the real question isn't whether I was right to trust David. Maybe the real question is, what do we owe to the people who stumble into our lives carrying their own broken pieces and desperate stories? I think we owe them the same thing we'd want if we were the ones standing on someone's doorstep at 9:47 p.m., clutching our own desperate hopes and broken dreams. A moment of genuine attention, a breath of compassion, and the kind of help that sees the person behind the crisis. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to find our way through the darkness, and sometimes the light we need comes from the most unexpected places. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have believed your partner immediately? Or would you have been suspicious? How do you think we should handle people who are struggling with reality in ways that affect our lives? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more real stories about the complicated, messy, beautiful ways we humans try to connect with each other. Because everyone has a story, and every story deserves to be heard with compassion. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.